On February 16, 2026, El Salvador's Navy intercepted a 180-foot cargo vessel drifting 380 nautical miles off its coastline in the Pacific Ocean. Navy divers went underwater and pulled 330 packages of cocaine out of the ship's ballast tanks, 6.6 tons of it, worth $165 million, while the DEA was simultaneously running one of the most aggressive coordinated assaults on CJNG infrastructure ever executed. This is the story of how a tiny Central American nation and the most powerful drug enforcement agency on the planet teamed up to make one of the world's most dangerous cartels feel something they haven't felt in a long time: pressure. For years, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, known as the CJNG, operated with a level of confidence that bordered on arrogance. And honestly, they earned it. These guys built a criminal empire spanning more than 40 countries, generating billions of dollars annually, and moving drugs through maritime routes, ports, and transit corridors across Latin America with near total impunity. They shot down a Mexican military helicopter in 2015. They've gone to war with the Mexican army and won. They flooded American streets with fentanyl and methamphetamine on an industrial scale. For a long time, nobody, not the DEA, not the Mexican government, not anyone, but could get a clean grip on them. But something shifted, and the story of how El Salvador and the DEA began systematically targeting CJNG drug transports is one of the most fascinating and consequential law enforcement stories happening right now. So if you want to understand exactly how this pressure campaign works, who made it possible, and what it's already cost the cartel, let's get into it. To understand why CJNG's transport routes are such a critical target, you have to understand how the cartel actually moves its product. The CJNG doesn't just grow drugs and sell them locally. They're a transnational logistics operation. Cocaine sourced from Colombia and Ecuador gets funneled northward through Central American waters, the Eastern Pacific Ocean being one of the primary corridors, using semi-submersibles, narco-submarines, go-fast boats, and commercial cargo vessels with drugs hidden in places most inspectors would never think to look. Ballast tanks, engine compartments, welded into steel walls. The February 2026 seizure off El Salvador's coast is a perfect example of this. 330 packages tucked inside a Tanzanian-flagged supply ship carrying crew members from Colombia, Nicaragua, Panama, and Ecuador. That's not a local operation. That's a multinational smuggling enterprise with sophisticated concealment methods and international crew coordination. And that is exactly the kind of infrastructure that both El Salvador and the DEA have been learning to dismantle. Now let's talk about El Salvador, because what's happened in this country over the last few years is genuinely one of the most dramatic national security transformations in recent memory, and it directly connects to their ability to hit cartels like the CJNG where it hurts. If you want to understand where El Salvador is today, you have to understand where it was, and where it was terrifying. Before President Nayib Bukele's crackdown, El Salvador was essentially a country under gang occupation. MS-13 and Barrio 18 weren't just street gangs, they were parallel governments in certain communities. They controlled neighborhoods, taxed businesses, recruited children, and turned El Salvador into one of the most dangerous countries in the Western Hemisphere. Homicide rates were catastrophic. Foreign investment was a joke. Ordinary Salvadorans lived in genuine daily fear of the violence that could erupt from any street corner at any moment. The state had largely ceded entire territories to these organizations, and for a generation of Salvadorans, that was just the reality of life. Then, March 27th, 2022 happened. After 62 people were murdered in a single day, one of the highest single-day death tolls the country had seen in decades, Bukele declared a state of emergency. And what followed was unlike anything the region had seen. Within the first few months, 52,000 suspected gang members were arrested. By 2025, that number had climbed past 83,600. MS-13 leadership structures were dismantled. Barrio 18 was crushed. The CECOT mega prison, built to hold 40,000 inmates across 236 acres, became the symbol of a government that had decided it was done negotiating with criminals. El Salvador recorded 776 consecutive days without a single homicide at one point. Let that sink in. A country that was once a byword for gang violence went nearly 3 years at various stretches without a murder being recorded. The transformation was staggering, and say what you want about the methods and the very legitimate human rights concerns that critics have raised about due process and conditions. The security results were undeniable. And look, I want to pause here for a second because it's important to say this clearly. Tens of thousands of ordinary Salvadorans spent years living under the kind of violence and terror that most of us will never understand. Parents afraid to let their kids walk to school. Business owners extorted monthly or killed for refusing. Communities paralyzed by fear. The fact that that changed, that those people got to breathe, matters. Whatever your view of the politics, the human cost of that era of gang dominance was immense, and the communities that bore it deserve to be part of this conversation. Now, here is where it gets relevant to the CJNG story. Because what Bukele built wasn't just a prison system. He built a security apparatus, a navy with real operational capacity, an intelligence framework capable of operating hundreds of nautical miles offshore, and critically, he built a government that was willing to position itself as a serious partner in the US-led war on transnational drug trafficking. If you want American cooperation, American intelligence, and American money flowing toward your law enforcement operations, you make yourself useful, and El Salvador made itself very useful. If you've been watching this channel and you're learning about this for the first time, drop a like on this video, because this is the kind of story that the mainstream news cycle barely touches, and we're going to break it all the way down. The numbers out of El Salvador's maritime interdiction operations are genuinely staggering when you see them in context. In 2023, El Salvador seized 3.6 tons of drugs total. That's not a small number, but it's not a headline either. Then 2024 happened, and El Salvador's Navy seized 17.2 tons, nearly 5 times the previous year's total, with 16.7 of those tons being pure cocaine pulled from the Pacific Ocean. The government valued those seizures at $422.7 million. For comparison, that's more cocaine seized by a country the size of Massachusetts than some of the region's larger nations were pulling in during the same period. One operation in December 2024 intercepted a load 1,050 nautical miles offshore, the furthest distance from El Salvador's coast that drugs had ever been intercepted in the nation's history. These aren't lucky busts. This is a systematically expanded surveillance operation with increasingly sophisticated reach, and it is directly bleeding CJNG and other cartels that use these Pacific transit corridors. Then February 2026 dropped the biggest number yet. The FMS Eagle, a 180-foot offshore supply vessel registered in Tanzania, was intercepted 380 nautical miles off El Salvador's coast. The ship looked legitimate. That was the point. But when Salvadoran Navy divers went underwater and started inspecting the ballast tanks, the water-filled compartments at the bottom of the hull that most people would never think to check, they pulled out 330 packages of cocaine, 6.6 tons, $165 million worth. 10 crew members from Colombia, Nicaragua, Panama, and Ecuador were arrested on the spot. The vessel was seized, and President Bukele put the total across 2024 and 2025 into perspective when he announced that El Salvador had seized 37.2 tons of cocaine worth $932 million across those 2 years combined. That is nearly $1 billion in product ripped directly out of transnational cartel supply chains. From a country that, 3 years earlier, was largely focused on trying to stop gang members from murdering its own citizens. Comment what you think about that number. $932 million in cocaine seized in 2 years from a country that most people couldn't find on a map. Because I genuinely want to know if you think this kind of pressure is actually making a dent, or if the cartels just reroute and keep moving. Drop it below. I'll be reading. Now let's talk about the DEA's side of this equation, because what the Americans have been doing to CJNG infrastructure during the same period is operating on an entirely different scale. And it starts with a designation that fundamentally changed the legal battlefield. On January 20th, 2025, President Trump signed Executive Order 14,157, directing the State Department to recommend foreign terrorist organization designations for major cartels within 14 days. On February 20th, 2025, that order came into effect and the CJNG was officially designated as a foreign terrorist organization and specially designated global terrorist. Now, if you've heard that phrase before and thought it was just political posturing, it isn't. The FTO designation is a legal weapon. It means that any individual or entity that provides material support to the CJNG, money, weapons, logistics, safe houses, anything, can now be prosecuted under terrorism statutes, not just drug trafficking laws. It blocks the cartel's access to the U.S. financial system entirely. It freezes any assets they hold or that pass through U.S. control. It expands the jurisdictional reach of law enforcement to pursue CJNG networks globally with tools that narcotics laws alone don't provide. In practical terms, it turned the DEA's already aggressive posture towards CJNG into something closer to a full counterterrorism operation. And the first major test of what that looks like in practice came in September 2025. From September 22nd to September 26th, 2025, the DEA ran a coordinated operational surge specifically targeting CJNG networks. Not Sinaloa, not Gulf Cartel. CJNG. 23 U.S. field divisions were activated simultaneously. 7 foreign operational regions were brought into the operation. When the week was over, the results were almost hard to believe. 670 arrests across the operation. Over 1 million counterfeit pills seized, the kind laced with fentanyl that kill people who think they're taking a pain pill or an anxiety medication. 22,842 kilograms of cocaine. 6,062 kilograms of methamphetamine. 92.4 kilograms of fentanyl powder. 33 kilograms of heroin. 244 firearms. $18.6 million in cash. $29.7 million in total assets seized in 5 days against a single cartel. That is what a coordinated FTO-powered enforcement surge against CJNG looks like when it's fully deployed. And that surge was not an isolated event. It was one operation within a sustained, multi-front campaign that was already producing results across the board. And if you want to stay up to date on exactly how this campaign keeps developing, because trust me, there are more chapters to this story, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. But here's where the story gets personal for the CJNG. Because while all of this was happening at the transport and distribution level, while El Salvador's Navy was bleeding their Pacific routes and the DEA was dismantling their U.S. distribution networks, the cartel was also taking catastrophic hits at the top of its own leadership structure. And nothing illustrates that better than what happened to Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez. Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, the son of El Mencho himself, and by all accounts, the operational right hand of the entire CJNG apparatus. This wasn't a mid-level enforcer or a regional boss. This was the heir apparent, the man who the cartel expected to eventually take over from El Mencho, the man who had been directing CJNG operations, violence, and drug imports since 2007. He oversaw the smuggling of massive quantities of methamphetamine and cocaine into the United States. Prosecutors said he personally ordered more than 100 killings. In 2015, it was El Menchito who directed the operation that shot down a Mexican military helicopter, killing 9 soldiers using a shoulder-fired rocket launcher. He was captured in Mexico in 2015 but continued running cartel operations from inside prison. He was eventually extradited to the United States in 2020, and after years of legal proceedings, a federal jury convicted him in September 2024. On March 7, 2025, U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell sentenced Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez to life in prison plus 30 years and ordered the forfeiture of over $6 billion in assets. $6 billion. The man who was supposed to be the future of the CJNG is now spending the rest of his life in a U.S. federal prison, and the cartel lost not just a leader, but a symbol, a signal to every CJNG member watching that the walls were closing in even on the untouchables. Now I want to hear from you on this one. Comment whether you think losing El Menchito to a life sentence actually weakened CJNG's operations, or if you think these organizations are structured well enough that they just absorb that kind of hit and keep moving. Because I honestly think people underestimate how much organizational chaos a leadership vacuum causes even in cartels. Let me know what you think below. But here's the thing. As devastating as losing El Mencho was for the CJNG, none of it compared to what happened on February 22, 2026. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, the man who built the CJNG from a splinter group into one of the globe's most feared criminal organizations. The man with a $10 million DEA bounty on his head. The man who had evaded capture for over a decade while his cartel grew into a presence across more than 40 countries. The man who was, in the eyes of many, the most powerful and dangerous drug lord alive after El Chapo went to prison. On February 22, 2026, El Mencho was killed. Mexican military forces conducted an operation in Tapalpa, Jalisco, aided by U.S. intelligence, that found El Mencho and his security detail. Gunfire erupted. El Mencho was hit. Security forces attempted to get him to Guadalajara for emergency medical treatment by helicopter, but he was too far gone. The aircraft was diverted to Morelia International Airport due to security concerns. El Mencho and 2 of his bodyguards died in the air. His body arrived at Mexico City International Airport on February 22nd. The Attorney General's office confirmed his identity through genetic analysis the following day. On March 3rd, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was buried in Zapopan in an elaborate funeral ceremony with a golden casket, a send-off that was as much a statement from the cartel as it was a goodbye. The retaliation was immediate and savage. Within hours of his death, CJNG members unleashed violence across multiple Mexican states. Road blockades, vehicle fires, shootouts, explosions. Jalisco, Guanajuato, Nayarit, Michoacán, Tamaulipas. All of them hit simultaneously in an orchestrated show of force from a cartel in grief and in rage. More than 70 people were killed in the retaliatory clashes. 25 National Guard members lost their lives. The Mexican government deployed 10,000 troops to try to contain the violence. Cities ground to a halt. Travel became dangerous. Communities that had nothing to do with any of this were caught in the crossfire, as they always are. And I think it's worth saying directly, because it's easy to get caught up in the strategy and the geopolitics and the seizure numbers and forget that behind all of this, there are real communities in Mexico, in Jalisco, in Guadalajara, in small towns across those 5 states that lit up in February 2026. Communities of ordinary people who woke up that morning and found themselves in the middle of a cartel war they never asked to be part of. People who couldn't go to work, couldn't take their kids to school, couldn't leave their houses. The fact that El Mencho is dead is a significant moment in the war on transnational crime. But the people who paid the immediate price for that moment were not cartel members. They were civilians, and that matters. Now, what does El Mencho's death actually mean for the CJNG going forward? That is the question that every analyst, every law enforcement agency, and frankly, every cartel watching from the sidelines is trying to answer right now. And the honest answer is, nobody fully knows yet. These organizations are built to survive leadership losses. They have regional commanders, financial networks, logistics infrastructure, and thousands of members who don't simply disappear because the man at the top is gone. The CJNG existed before El Mencho made it what it is, and it will attempt to continue without him. But here's what makes this moment different. El Mencho didn't die in isolation. He died at the end of a sustained multi-front pressure campaign that has been hitting the CJNG from every direction simultaneously. Their Pacific drug transport routes are being intercepted by El Salvador's rapidly expanding naval interdiction capability. Their U.S. distribution networks were torn apart in a 5-day DEA surge that resulted in 670 arrests. Their financial infrastructure is being squeezed by FTO designation, asset freezes, and sanctions. El Mencho, the chosen successor, is in a U.S. federal prison for life. And now El Mencho himself is dead. That is not a cartel absorbing one punch and adjusting. That is a cartel absorbing simultaneous body shots to its logistics, its finances, its leadership pipeline, and its founding figure, all within the same rolling period of enforcement. The question now is whether that pressure holds, whether El Salvador continues to expand its maritime reach, whether the DEA sustains the operational tempo it demonstrated in September 2025, whether the FTO designation continues to be used aggressively to pursue CJNG supporters and financiers globally, Whether Mexico, with U.S. intelligence support, can move quickly enough against whoever attempts to claim El Mencho's throne before that person has time to consolidate power and rebuild what was lost. Comment what you think comes next for the CJNG. Do they fracture and splinter into smaller competing factions? Or does someone step up and hold the organization together? I genuinely don't know the answer to that one, and I think it's one of the most consequential questions in the transnational crime world right now. What we do know is this: El Salvador's transformation from a gang-terrorized state into a serious maritime enforcement partner didn't happen by accident. Bukele built a security apparatus with real capability and then pointed it at the Pacific drug corridors that cartels like the CJNG treat as their private shipping lanes. The results: 37.2 tons of cocaine worth nearly $1 billion seized in 2 years, capped by a $165 million record bust pulled from a vessel's ballast tanks 380 nautical miles offshore. Show that the Eastern Pacific is no longer the permissive environment it once was for cartel logistics. And the DEA's parallel campaign, now supercharged by the FTO designation that turned drug enforcement into counterterrorism, has demonstrated in real operational results. 670 arrests, 77,000 kilograms of drugs seized, $30 million in assets, a life sentence for El Mencho's son. That the U.S. side of this pressure is not symbolic. It is grinding, it is sustained, and it is clearly having an effect. The CJNG is not finished. Anyone who tells you a single operation, a single death, or even a sustained enforcement campaign has ended an organization this size and this deeply embedded is either naive or selling you something. But for the first time in a long time, the most powerful cartel in the world is operating under genuine, coordinated, multi-directional pressure. And the people who benefit most from that, if the pressure holds, are the ordinary communities in Mexico and Central America that have lived under CJNG's shadow for more than a decade. That is the story of how El Salvador and the DEA are humiliating CJNG by targeting their drug transports. And something tells me this story is far from over. If you want to stay locked in as it develops, make sure you're subscribed, drop a like if this gave you something to think about, and click another video on your screen to keep watching more stories like this one.